China's bad. The Chinese government is bad. Chinese culture is bad. Their culinary practices are bad. Their tech is bad. Their handling of COVID was bad. Their relationships with countries like Pakistan, Iran, and all of the African nations are bad. China is bad for American jobs. China is bad for manufacturing. China is bad for human rights. China is bad for starting viral pandemics. China is bad for global peace. China is bad for democracy. China is bad for freedom. China is bad. That sums up how we here in the United States see China. We see China near exclusively through our assumptions, which are rooted in our values and our vision of what is good. And what's good for the world is us, right? Because for something to be presented as bad, then there must be something opposing it, which is good. So what's good? It's us. We may not actually use the word bad in our headlines, in our entertainment, but the insinuation is constant. China, for us, is this alien, rigid, suspect, and dangerous foreign land that threatens our influence in the world. And threatening our influence in the world threatens us. This imagining of China as a threat, as uncivilized, has been more than 100 years in the making. But what would a reimagining of China look like? What would that look like in our newsrooms and our media? Is that even possible? Welcome to Backspace, where we tell you how the story is told in our headlines, and then we think about how we can tell it differently. For the last decade, China's been the big, bad, scary, red communist specter on the horizon of America's influence in the world.
A lot of American jobs, millions, have been outsourced to communist China.
The president has held China accountable for covering up the China virus and allowing it to spread death and economic destruction in America and around the world.
Beijing's actions continue to undermine the rules-based order.
China increasingly is a near-peer competitor, challenging the United States in multiple arenas while pushing to revise global norms in ways that favor the authoritarian Chinese system.
But that's not really anything new. The media narratives around China are expressed differently today than they were a century ago in how they're expressed, but they have the same core elements. They still construct China, and thus the Chinese, as inherently uncivilized, and thus a threat.
I feel like a lot of times when it comes to China and Western reporting, it's very information light, but emotion heavy. It's entirely comprised of conclusions. And I think that goes against journalistic professionalism because you're supposed to show, not tell.
When I'm talking about how the Chinese are envisioned as uncivilized, what I mean is the unquestioned and exclusive framing of nearly 1.5 billion people as not only repressed, but as unable to exist outside that repression. It's the idea that everything the Chinese government does and everything that happens in China is within the context of authoritarianism, with the government's means and often ends being repression. Take, for example, how coverage of China's handling of the COVID-19 outbreak in early 2020 was consistently referred to as draconian. A response that included the very same lockdowns that became a major strategy in many parts of the world for fighting the virus's spread.
We need to go back to the early coverage of COVID. Part of it is that our journalists in China tend to be political journalists, and we covered it as a political story. We were really focused on regime type, for example, as a distinguishing factor. And I think that it led a lot of people to conclude that because this is all about China as an authoritarian country, the United States, as anything but authoritarian, would be, immune to this virus.
Or how Chinese tech, which once was thought of as impossible to innovate given the repressive climate, is now discussed primarily in U.S. coverage within the scope of surveillance or questionable privacy practices. Not that the American tech industry knows anything about that. The way repression is presented in the context of China stories, it's made into an inseparable part of China and the experience of being Chinese, which hinges, again, on a complete lack of civilization, which we define by the United States' values. The one-party system is seen as archaic, anti-democratic, and thus anti-liberal. The official state ideology of communism is anti-human nature and it's anti-Christian, which not only matters to a lot of people in this country, but it matters in a greater context because Christianity is foundational for Euro-American civilization.
We talk about China as needing to join the international community or working with the international community. The assertion there is China, in a sense, just isn't quite as civilized as the rest of us. It hasn't achieved the same standards of civilization as the hallowed members of the international community.
When coverage of China isn't about how repressive it is to its citizens, then it's about how China is constantly working to undermine American influence in the world. And it's this trope of China and the Chinese as a looming threat to all things American that is the primary driver of coverage of China in this country. And it's a trope almost as old as Chinese immigration to the United States. The first Chinese immigrants came here in the 1850s and quickly became a source of cheap labor. They built the Transcontinental Railroad. They became domestic help, laundry workers, farm workers. Any kind of cheap labor that was needed, you'd find Chinese immigrants at the helm of it in the late 19th century.
And it got to a point where it was decided that there were too many Chinese immigrants in the United States. The proportion of Chinese immigrants in the United States was tiny compared to the overall population. So it was something like 0.02%. But it was decided that this problem was so big that imminent action had to be taken, and that's why the ban came in.
The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was one of the earliest pieces of anti-immigration legislation in the United States. The idea that was popularized early on through that ban was that the Chinese pose a great cultural and economic threat due to the sheer size of their population.
A very long-running visual image of the China threat, something that's been sort of reproduced and recycled over time, is this idea that there are sort of limitless Chinese people who can threaten the United States. That we still had this idea that there are overwhelming numbers of Chinese people that one day will just consume somehow the United States. Today, the more sort of subtle way that this is produced throughout the Western media, you get these images of, there'll be a story about the Chinese economy, for example, about how it's growing. But it'll be accompanied by a picture of the Chinese military, and it'll be a photograph of lines of Chinese soldiers all sort of holding their guns in an identical way, sort of on a parade or a march or something like that.
And that construction of limitless Chinese people evolves into limitless Chinese economic reach and power, which the heads of this country openly speak out against.
I will not stand by when our competitors don't play by the rules.
Look, we've been losing over many years, 4, 5, $600 billion a year.
China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal.
We've brought trade cases against China at nearly twice the rate as the last administration.
They have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world.
We're losing a few years ago 200 routinely to China. We can't do that.
That's not going to happen on my watch, because the United States is going to continue to grow and expand.
If the playing field is level, I promise you, America will always win.
Now, here's something interesting. For a good part of the late 19th and early 20th century, it was the Chinese people who were seen as economic threats, as backwards, and as uncivilized. China itself, according to American opinion and policy, wasn't. The threat of China only came about after 1949, after Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party took power following a long civil war. It led an already anti-communist United States in the midst of the Cold War to become obsessed with China's new identity and system, which put it in the Soviet Union's camp. It's an obsession which was aggressively mixed with the preceding characterizations of the Chinese. Coverage today still relies on declarations of a communist China or red China or rising China, using the same images, colors, and framing that position China in diametric opposition to American values and civilization. Red China, communist China, totally normal, like when we say corporatist democracy only for some United States, right? And these depictions of China rely at their root on the premise of endless invading Chinese, images which have been ingrained into the American imagination after more than a century of threat construction. These images were reinforced by the fact that U.S. and Chinese forces engaged in a hot war in Korea starting in 1950, when China came to the aid of its socialist allies who were fighting a U.S.-backed regime in the South. at least 250,000 Chinese troops intervened initially and prevented the United States from overrunning what became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so whether we're talking about Chinese immigrants in the late 1800s or Cold War China in the 50s and 60s, there is a thread of continuity underpinning the narrative of what kind of a threat the Chinese and China posed to the United States. Now, there was a moment of ideological reprieve when, in the 1970s, China was perceived to be opening up to so-called Western and capitalist values. And weirdly enough, that reprieve, if we want to call it that, was rooted in moves by the Richard Nixon administration. Nixon wasn't a fan of the People's Republic of China. Time and time again, he referred to the country as having uncivilized behavior and as the greatest Asian threat to the United States. But he believed that the goal should be to change what the status quo had been for so long. In 1971, seeing an opportunity for the U.S. to isolate the USSR following the Sino-Soviet split, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, traveled to China for secret talks. Shortly after, Nixon became the first American president to visit the People's Republic. He came back exalting the Chinese leadership and the prospect for peaceful relations. During this period, while China was still being painted as a threat in U.S. media, there was a romanticization of Chinese culture and lifestyle and what prospects a rapprochement between the two countries could bring. But this quiet excitement burst in the 80s.